Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. Since I started the podcast, I've looked at all aspects of the war from the point of view of various countries, but one glaring omission has been any Australian narrative of the war. The Australians fought across the world in land, sea and air, notably in the Pacific and the Middle East, which is what we'll be discussing today. With the fall of France, her overseas territories predominantly remained loyal to the French Vichy regime, and this was true for Syria and the Lebanon. To the south were the British in Egypt, with Rommel fighting in the Western Desert and the Germans fostering an uprising in Iraq. The British feared Germany may take over Syria and the Lebanon. From there, the Nazis could supply rebels in Iraq and threaten Egypt from two sides. General Wavell was ordered by Churchill to go on the offensive and take the French territories. It wasn't envisaged the French would put up much of a fight. The bulk of the Allied attacking force will be made up of the Australian 7th Division. Joining me today is Richard James. Richard is the author of Australia's War with France, the campaign in Syria and the Lebanon, 1941. Now, it's a big thank you to David Phillipson, who is president of the Australian-based History Guild, a charity promoting historical literacy for all. David reached out to me to suggest I have a chat with James. If you're interested in finding out more about the History Guild, go to historyguild.org. Richard, thanks for joining me. Shall we start with some background? Australia declared war in 1939. What was motivating her to fight a war which at this point was, well, half a world away?
It's basically automatic following the British. You know, as soon as the British declared war on the Germans, Australia, within a matter of days was also at war almost automatically. And so the process of sort of raising an army began in 1939. You know, during the interwar period, Australia didn't really have much of a standing army at all. They sort of kept an officer corps and basically reserve units. But in 1939, even before there'd been any real hostilities, Australia began the process of raising a volunteer army with the intention that they'd go to Europe and fight somewhere in Europe.
Forgive me being British, but I suspect this is probably known to most Australians. I'm right in saying that if you volunteer for the Australian Army, you could volunteer for the Army but not to serve abroad during the war. Have I got that right?
Yes. So my understanding of it is that in the specific context of the Second World War, of that time, they were raising an expedition corps. So they were raising a force specifically to go overseas. So you were basically volunteering to go overseas. The militia or the sort of army reserve that was already in existence, they were the opposite. They actually weren't. It wasn't part of the deal for them to serve overseas. They were only supposed to go into action to defend Australia itself if that became necessary. And there became some interesting turn of events when the Japanese invaded, say, New Guinea, which technically was Australian territory. And so you had these sort of militia troops sent up to fight in New Guinea. But yes, those volunteers who joined in 1939 and 1940 fully expected to go overseas to fight.
Yeah, the border with it becomes a bit elastic for what's classed as Australian, doesn't it? As the war progresses. So they're first sent to, is it the Middle East? Well, they weren't sent directly to Britain. Was they sent to the Middle East as a staging post?
Exactly, and so the first body of troops that was raised was the 6th Division. There were 5 Australian divisions in the First World War, and so they kind of started off with the 6th Division in the Second World War. And it was basically kind of mirroring what happened in the First War. They were being sent to the Middle East, to Palestine, with the idea that they would train there or somewhere in that area, whether it was Egypt or somewhere in the Near East, in the British part, with the expectation that they'd probably end up fighting somewhere in Europe, possibly in France, where we fought in the First World War. But then while the that Australian group of Australian soldiers were at sea making their way across, that was when the Germans launched their blitzkrieg, and all, you know, within a matter of weeks, France had fallen and Europe was basically taken over by the Germans. And so the Australians then turned up in in the Middle East, not really being sure what was going to happen to them. And those Australians ended up fighting first in North Africa and then after that in Greece. But then the Australians that ended up in the Syrian campaign that we're going to discuss, they were the 7th Division. So that was raised slightly later, the following year in 1940, and the same story. They were sent to Palestine without really knowing where they were going to fight, and they were sent to Egypt, and then eventually ended up in Syria and Lebanon. There was one brigade of Australians who fought in this campaign that were it was kind of formed in England from kind of various kind of smaller outfits that had found their way to England or ended up in England for whatever reason, was amalgamated into a fighting brigade. But yeah, basically they all went from Australia to the Middle East is generally how it went.
So I touched on two things. So we get the fall of France, and we've got this campaign that's going to be launched in Syria, the Lebanon, the Levant. So this is French territory. So with the fall of France, what did the French colonial possessions sort of in Syria, the Levant, but are we just going to refer to it as the Levant, or is that geographically incorrect?
No, I think that it's a bit of an old-fashioned term that you don't hear much anymore. But I think that's sort of the French designation for that area, basically Syria and Lebanon. So the Levant, I think, is a good way to refer to it. That's how I kind of refer to it in the book. So officially, it wasn't a colony. It was a mandate, but in that it was supposed to be the French leading, them on the path towards independence. But of course, to all intents and purposes, it was just a colony like any other. But yes, so when France fell to the Germans, you had this question across the entire French Empire as to what was going to happen to these colonial possessions. It was a question in Syria and Lebanon, but it was also a question in Indochina, in North Africa, in Equatorial Africa. So all these colonies, each of which sort of had an army of its own, technically answerable to the mainland, but with really quite a lot of autonomy. The question was what they were going to do, and in Syria and Lebanon, as with all of them, there was this instinct to try and continue the fight alongside the British. That was kind of seemed to be the first instinct, and certainly the army of the Levant in Syria and Lebanon, that was kind of what the commanders initially wanted to do. And there was this kind of political tug of war going on where the French administration, which was now set up at Vichy, they kind of had to go and really put pressure on all these colonial armies to say, you're not allowed to continue the fight. And the official stance that was taken was that they were neutral. They were supposed to basically just not take a side in the war. But then obviously it was complicated by Charles de Gaulle, because he was then getting involved trying to, we might have to backtrack and talk a bit about him and how he got started, but he was trying to win traveling the world and win these colonial armies over to his cause as well. But effectively, these colonies were supposed to stay neutral under the terms of the armistice between Germany and France.
So de Gaulle's the Free French leader who escapes to Britain, isn't he, and sets up the Free French. And did he have any luck reaching out to, presumably he must have known some of these people in the army of the Levant to woo them over to his cause, because presumably if you can get the military to come over to him, the political regime in the Levant would have had no choice.
So he sort of set up in London, as you said, and he kind of got on the BBC radio and issued this appeal to the French that he was going to continue the fight on his own, and that he didn't recognise this surrender and the armistice with Germany, and that the French government that had set itself up in Vichy, that he thought that they'd basically given up the claim on being the representative at France, and that he himself was sort of carrying the torch for France, even though at that stage he was sort of a nobody. He was not even a particularly prominent commander in the French hierarchy. He was a relatively junior general. There were French soldiers and sailors who had ended up in Britain, most of them having been evacuated from Dunkirk. None of them were particularly interested in joining up with him. Most of them seemed to prefer to stay where they were and get sent back to France and see out the war under the Germans. So he kind of started this political campaign, travelling around to the different colonies, and he did sort of pick up some support in equatorial kind of backwaters, Brazzaville, and a few of these lesser-known colonial armies, and he was able to pick up a few troops here and there. He and the British sent an expedition to Dakar in Senegal, which was quite a prominent French outpost, in the hope of kind of turning them in favour of the Gaullists, and that was a bit of a failure, and that almost turned into an outright war between the two French sides. And there were attempts to sort of win the army in Syria and Lebanon over by political means. The French and the British got together and tried to orchestrate a coup to sort of bring them over to the Gaullists, and that sort of all fell flat. This is obviously all happening, in 1940. De Gaulle really, at this stage of the war, didn't have much going for him. He'd assembled a force of kind of a few thousand French soldiers from all over the place, and he was sort of receiving British sponsorship, but even the British found him a pain, to be honest, because he was very much sort of he would go off on these anti-British tirades. He was a very proud Frenchman, and he really was very mistrustful of anything English, even though he was kind of wholly reliant on the British for sponsorship of his mission.
When you read about de Gaulle, it never fails to amaze me how people put up with him, because he somehow never comes out well. Now, it could be the way that people write about it, but there isn't many. I presume French histories will be very different from the English histories, where he always comes out as a prickly, very difficult character, and you wonder how anyone put up with him.
You get the feeling that he wasn't a particularly personable sort of guy, and he had his beliefs and knew what he wanted and wouldn't let anything stand in his way.
It's just obstinate. So I wonder, for the British, was the French in the Levant potentially a security threat? I mean, could they have just ignored them there if they're being benign?
Yes, this is the question. It's something that I tried to grapple with, and I guess the conclusion that I come to after all this is that they probably could have and should have just ignored it. There was a concern that the Germans would take over Syria, and that was a threat because Britain had its base in Cairo and controlled the Suez Canal, and that was very important strategically. And the British were fighting in the Western Desert in North Africa. That was the sort of western side of that theatre of operations against the Italians and then against Rommel and the Germans. And so they were worried about a threat on the other side, the eastern side, which would have been if the Germans were somehow able to come down through Turkey and into Syria and Lebanon and threaten from the other side in a kind of pincer move. But in the aftermath, the Germans, some German army people have said, look, it was discussed, but it was never really taken seriously as an option. The more important thing was probably control of the air and air bases and air power, and so it was the use of Syrian airfields by the Germans that sparked this war. That was the thing that really, I think, the British were most worried about, is if the Germans were somehow able to establish air bases in Syria. They could then conduct air raids on Cairo. That was the thing that really set it off. It was, whilst all this was going on, there was an uprising in Iraq, which was a British territory, and sort of in the same way that Syria and Lebanon were French territory. The local kind of Iraqis, in both amongst the civilian population and in the army, even though it was kind of British officered, there was quite a strong pro-German sentiment. Like the Germans were conducting all this political intrigue and kind of promising they were going to help set up an independent Arab state and all these things. And so the locals kind of overthrew the regent, who was kind of the British puppet, in charge of Iraq, and they kind of took over the army and were kind of conducting this insurrection, and this got Hitler's attention, and they thought, oh, well, maybe we can lend a hand to the Iraqis, and that could be a threat to the British in the Middle East. Nothing really came of that, and you get the feeling that, once again, from the German side, it wasn't that well thought through, it wasn't well resourced, it was just kind of an opportunistic thing. So in Beirut, the commander there was a Dentz, was his name, General Dentz, and he'd been the one who actually surrendered to the Germans in Paris. He was then sent to Beirut to sort of, he was the High Commissioner, so he had a political role, but he was also the commander of the army, and he received this order, and he was strictly pursuing a policy of neutrality. When I read about this campaign, as I started researching it and started hearing about it and speaking to some of the Australian veterans who participated in it, you would always hear the Vichy French, they were collaborators with the Nazis, they were evil, they were on the side of the Germans. That's kind of seems to be, certainly here in Australia, that's the, if anyone knows about this part of the war, that's the way they frame it. But the reality is definitely more complicated, because Dentz and his army at that point were neutral, and they were certainly more pro-British than pro-German at that point. They certainly weren't on the side of the Germans. However, on the mainland of France, the Vichy cabinet, the Vichy government, they were the ones who were potentially interested in pursuing a policy of collaboration with Germans, and they were the ones who sent these orders to Beirut to say, okay, these German planes are going to be landing in your aerodromes on their way to Iraq. We need you to give them safe passage to refuel them. There was actually almost an uprising amongst the local troops in Syria and Lebanon because of that. Like no one was happy that was happening, but they were sort of forced to comply with with the orders from Vichy France. And once the British realised what was going on, Churchill got wind of this, and he then sent orders to General Wavell, who was in charge of the British Army in the Middle East, and said, you need to go and sort this out to sort of subdue the German threat. And that's what started it off. Wavell was always, constantly complaining that he never had enough troops, never had enough resources, and he always had Churchill breathing down his neck, telling him to attack here and attack there. And so he was sort of reluctantly forced into taking action there.
Well, I made some notes of troop numbers, but admittedly this is the fall of France. The British have 35 to 50,000 British Commonwealth, 100,000, I don't know why I put native troops. I don't know what native to where, but anyway. And Italy at 500,000. That's before the Africa Corps arrived. So the British are outnumbered, although obviously we did quite well against the Italians in 41 before the Africa Corps arrives. But I mean, if you look at the army of the Levant, how much... how well equipped is the army of the Levant? Are they just French colonial troops, or is it full of crack Foreign Legion units?
It was a mix. So it was sort of a mix of local troops. They were all French officered, but the actual soldiers were from all over the place. So you did have plenty of garrisons where they were local Syrian and Lebanese troops, and they weren't particularly well equipped or well trained or well disciplined, as you can probably imagine. Probably the bulk of the force was like colonial troops, like a lot of North Africans from Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia, these colonial regiments, and then you did have Foreign Legion troops there as well. And they were probably the best troops, and they did have an armored an element of armor as well. They had these tanks, these R-35 tanks that were quite effective. The Australians or the British didn't really have a corresponding armoured force, and so that was quite decisive. They were quite well equipped, and however they were isolated. So, when the campaign began, there was probably roughly a parity in terms of the power that both sides could bring, but you could see, as the campaign progressed, it wasn't a long campaign, but as the weeks passed, the British were able to bring up a lot of troops. They probably tripled or quadrupled the force over the course of that month that they were fighting, whereas General Dent's and his army in Syria and Lebanon, they were completely cut off. So, the British kind of controlled the sea lanes in the Mediterranean. They couldn't receive supplies. They couldn't receive reinforcements. They couldn't get any troops or anything down overland through Turkey. That politically sort of wasn't possible. And they were kind of surrounded on all sides. So, by the end of the campaign, they were certainly overwhelmed and outnumbered.
It's the Australian 7th Division that make up the bulk of this attacking force, isn't it? Had they already been in action, or had they literally just landed there? They're fresh to the Middle East, fresh to the fighting?
Yes, it was the first taste of action for the 7th Division. So they'd been in the Middle East for a long time by that point. They were encamped in Palestine, and then eventually they got sent to Egypt, but they were well behind the front lines, just kind of on garrison duty, basically, and they were kind of watching on as the 6th Division was fighting in the Western Desert, and that was fair enough. The 6th Division was the first Australian division that arrived, so they first went into battle. But then this, it became obvious that the next place that the fight would move was Greece, and so it seemed logical that the 7th Division would go and fight in Greece, but for some political reasons, and it ended up being switched around. So the 6th Division, having just finished fighting in the desert, all of a sudden turns around and goes to Greece and fights there, whilst the guys in the 7th Division are still sitting around doing nothing. And then you have the 8th and 9th Divisions. The 8th Division was sent to Singapore, but the 9th Division then arrived in the Middle East, and they got sent to straight into the fight in Tobruk. And all the while, these guys from the 7th Division were sitting around waiting for the chance to join the war. So they sort of felt like they were missing out. And yes, it turned out that this campaign was their first real fight. So
they make up the bulk of the troops. Does that mean the operations under... I forgot what's the name of the operation? I did make it's go right.
Operation Exporter was the name that was given by the British.
So does that mean it's under Australian control?
Well, that's another interesting point. So it wasn't. It was really left up to General Wavell to figure all this out. So he sort of looked around and said, okay, really, the only troops I've possibly got to spare are this Australian 7th Division, which is kind of defending Egypt. So the division has 3 brigades, 2 of which were in Egypt, and one of which was at Tobruk. So these 2 brigades, Wavell said, okay, this is going to be my main fighting force. And then he had some... the Free French had their force, which really numerically wasn't much, and there was a brigade, an Indian brigade, so a British officered Indian troops, and also some for whatever reason some British soldiers as well in that group. So it was really a disparate sort of force, but certainly the Australians made up the bulk of the numbers. The sort of command of the campaign was given to a guy by the name of General Wilson, who had the nickname Jumbo. He wasn't particularly well regarded by the Australians, and he didn't particularly like the Australians either. The Australians kind of thought that this guy was a bit lazy and a bit kind of maybe stuffy, whereas he thought the Australians were a bunch of undisciplined sort of larrikins, and he led the the campaign in Greece, which had been a failure. So he ended up in charge of the campaign. He was set up in Jerusalem in his luxurious hotel and planned to stay there whilst the actual fighting went on, hundreds of miles away. And then they had this funny deal where at a certain point, he was going to start in charge of the campaign, and then at a certain point, once they reached a particular objective, they were going to hand over command of the campaign to the Australians. It was just this very odd sort of arrangement. Like they sort of said, the Australian administrative corps isn't ready to start a fight. You've got your troops ready, but you've just returned from Greece. It's all a bit of a mess. So we, the British, will start in command and then kind of hand it over to you. But it was almost like, the way I read it is, it was an excuse for the British to, if things were going well, they'd keep hold of command, and as soon as things turned bad, they could kind of wash their hands of it.
Pass the book,
yeah. But in terms of the troops on the ground, General Wavell, the Australian commander, he was in charge of the fighting force, that is the entire fighting force, and he was actually up there with the troops, kind of commanding the operation, receiving his orders from Wilson. But yes, so the Australians were in charge, on the actual front line.
Now, had the French anticipated an attack? Did they expect the British to make a move on the Levant?
I don't think that they did. It's really interesting to sort of look back over that period of 6 to 12 months leading up to this campaign and try and figure out what was actually going on both sides. A lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of miscommunication. And so there was this thinking amongst the British and amongst the Gaullists, the Free French, that they wouldn't fight. This army of the Levant, as soon as they saw Allied troops, British troops or Free French troops at the border, they would sort of lay down their weapons. So it was actually not expected that there would be a fight. It was kind of sort of put together with the expectation that it would be more of a political campaign. It seems to be the expectation on the British side. On the side of the army of the Levant, I don't think they expected this, because certainly it wasn't like they'd made plans as to how they were going to react. They were always, in hindsight, it was obvious to them that they were going to just defend against anyone, because I strongly believe that if the roles were reversed and the Germans had tried to take over Syria, you would have had a fight all the same. So I think they were just going to fight against whoever came and tried to take their territory from them.
They were sort of fighting to remain neutral in a war that the home country was struggling to be, remain French, I guess, rather than neutral.
Exactly. And one of the interesting aspects of the campaign is this kind of almost like a civil war between Frenchmen. So you had Charles de Gaulle's force as part of the invading force. And so you had Frenchmen fighting Frenchmen, and the Gaullists believed that they were fighting on behalf of France and that they were carrying on the war and that they were in the right, whereas those in the army of the Levant, they believed that they were doing the right thing by obeying the Vichy government, which was the official French government. So yes, it was literally a French civil war. And even though the Gaullists weren't a big part of the fighting force, that sort of political aspect really dominated the campaign in terms of the lead up to it and the aftermath.
Well, yeah, they have to be seen to be taking part rather than necessarily directly taking part. So we have a relatively well-equipped, formidable force. They're not necessarily expecting an attack. So as the Allies cross the border, how does the attack go in? I mean, I think it's probably worth pointing out that we're not looking. It's easy to think the Middle East is just desert. This is not flat open plains that guys are just being lorried across, is it? This is actually quite a difficult country.
Absolutely, very difficult terrain. So, Syria and the Lebanon, kind of we're talking about this basically amalgamating them as a single unit, but they were separate countries, and geographically they're quite different and quite distinct. So most of Syria is that, as you can imagine, a flat expanse of desert, basically. But certainly in Lebanon, it's very rugged, very mountainous. You've got the coast, along the coast of the Mediterranean. You have a mountain range, which is the Lebanon range, that is very rugged and is very close to the sea. And then you have a flat valley called the Bekaa Valley, and then another mountain range, the anti-Lebanon, sort of running along the border with Syria, and they kind of meet down along the southern border with what was in Palestine. And so you had this incredibly rugged country, some of the most difficult terrain to traverse that you can imagine. It certainly wasn't like fighting out in open desert, certainly for the Australians, because the British and Australians split themselves up into sort of three groups, and there were sort of three routes that they were trying to advance northwards, one along the coast, one kind of between the mountain ranges, and another in Syria out in the desert. And the Australians were in those two sectors closest to the coast, where the terrain was incredibly rocky, incredibly rugged, incredibly steep, very much in favour of the defending force. And the defenders in the army of the Levant had been there for sometimes months or years, kind of setting up their defensive positions, not because they were expecting the Australians or the British to come across, but just that's where they'd been based for years. So it was an interesting kind of fighting. It was very much at I guess you could say close quarters, but it was more that it was difficult to command a large body of troops with any kind of coordinated action. Like, there was no communication. They would try, and the wireless sets wouldn't work. The telephone cables, they wouldn't work. So it was really small groups kind of fighting these small battles without a lot of idea of what was going on everywhere else. So yeah, it was quite an interesting type of warfare that was very much dictated by this difficult terrain.
And it's the centre that gets bogged down, which causes the coastal flank to actually be forced to halt, doesn't it? So it doesn't go too far.
Exactly. And so, there's a debate going on in the lead up as to how they proceed with this. They've got these three potential routes of advance, and the question was, do we prioritize one? Do we prioritize going along the coast towards Beirut? Do we prioritize the desert towards Damascus? And in the end, they kind of sent a relatively equal force along all three routes. And yes, that coastal force, which was the Australians, that was the 21st Brigade, they made quite good progress along the coast in the first couple of weeks, whereas the Australians in the centre got pinned down literally within sight of the border, or to be more accurate, they kind of made an advance during the first week, and then the army of the Levant counterattacked, particularly with these tanks that I mentioned that the Australians didn't really have any answer to. And so the Australians were pushed back in that central area, and so the guys on the coast were sort of told to basically stop and wait, because their flank was exposed because the central column couldn't keep up. So, that was another cause of frustration. On the coast, they were sort of closing in on Beirut, but yet they were given orders to just sit around and wait while this fighting went on in the mountains. And that's one area you can reflect and say, would the Australians have been better off to just put as much force as they could along the coast and try and take Beirut, and maybe that could have been a more effective strategy, but they then ran the risk of being cut off from behind. So it's hard to say, even in hindsight, what was the best thing to do.
What I found fascinating was the fact that I can't but think the French up to a point played their cards quite well. And if you've got tanks, however poor quality those tanks are, and those tanks attack infantry who have absolutely nothing to combat them, those tanks are just fantastic. They're a godsend, and the French seem to use them remarkably well. And the big oversight from the Allies seems to be this lack of supplying the infantry with anything to combat these tanks when they magically appeared and then withdrew again. Because that's the other thing the French seemed to do quite well. They were happy to give up territory.
Yes, I agree. And I think, they fought a very intelligent campaign, and these tanks proved quite decisive. And certainly the British, in hindsight, should have brought more tanks of their own. I mean, that's always easy to say. Wavell he was literally getting by with whatever he could. I mean, the British tanks were all committed in the Western Desert. This was all happening, this war in Syria and Lebanon was happening at the same time as the British were planning this big counter-offensive against Rommel, which was Operation Battle Axe, and so the tanks were all committed there. You feel like it's a bit of a half measure in both directions. Like, I think in hindsight, perhaps the British would have been better off just forgetting Syria and committing everything they had to defeating the Germans and the Italians in North Africa, because Wavell, he had a lot of success against the Italians, pushed them all the way back, almost out of Libya, but then he sort of stopped and kind of dug in, didn't advance, and even started withdrawing troops that he then put to the fight in Greece and in Syria. And then all of a sudden Rommel was able to counterattack and push him all the way back. So he kind of wasn't able to actually achieve real success anywhere. It was kind of a half measure. So in Syria and Lebanon, it was really interesting the way I talked about this, how the Vichy French were able to counterattack against the Australians, and they did the same thing on the Damascus front, which was where the British were fighting, which was this Indian brigade, and there was a couple of occasions where as you said, the French would kind of strategically withdraw, cede territory on their own terms, and these British units would kind of come and install themselves, be it in a town or in some kind of stronghold, and then all of a sudden the tanks would counterattack, and they quite literally decimated an entire brigade. Like, the French would come in with their tanks, round up a bunch of British or Indian troops, take them prisoner, and then within less than 12 hours, they'd disappear again off into the mountains. They fought very well. Okay, in the end they lost the campaign, but they did about as good a job as you could hope. And I think the British sort of did their best to almost lose a war that they really should have won. And certainly the Australians had a lot of respect for the army of the Levant, and you saw, once the campaign did conclude, they spoke very highly of those French troops, particularly the Foreign Legion troops. The Australians in the mountains fought against the Foreign Legion quite a lot and spoke very highly of them. Of course, we've talked about the tanks, but interestingly, on the around Damascus, you actually had the French Foreign Legion on both sides, and so that was the one spot where the whole thing actually unraveled, because for those French Foreign Legion troops, that they didn't really seem to care about fighting French, but when they realized that there were Foreign Legion troops on the other side of the lines, that's when the Foreign Legion troops who were fighting for de Gaulle basically refused to fight. One of de Gaulle's prominent commanders, a guy by the name of Monclar, a commander of the Legion troops, when he realized that it was Foreign Legion on the other side, he abandoned the fight, basically, and that caused all sorts of problems, in that Damascus area. That's fair.
Yeah, Legion refusing to fight Legion. There's also, I can't see in my notes other than alluding to it, there's a story about how de Gaulle, the Free French were meant to seize Damascus symbolically, and then they don't.
So
have I got that right?
Yes. So that it was set up to sort of give the appearance that the Free French were the ones who were taking Damascus. So this entire campaign has a separate context, a sort of subtext, which is this rivalry between Britain and France about control of this region, because the Germans are officially the enemy, but really it's historically been Britain and France that for hundreds of years have kind of vied for control, France having kind of traditionally been in control of Syria and Lebanon, and the British more in Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine. And de Gaulle in particular, seems to have been more worried about what the British were up to than the Germans. He was very suspicious that the British were going to use this as a chance to take over Syria and Lebanon and oust the French, which was probably not that far from the truth. But the British realised that they had to be a little bit careful, so they didn't want to be seen as the ones who were taking Damascus. They really wanted to give the impression that it was the Free French. And you also see this in the communiques and the way the war is reported. It's quite often, Free French troops accompanied by British. That's sort of the order in which it was listed, when in reality it was exactly the opposite. And so this British Indian Brigade advanced across the frontier and sort of established a bit of a bridgehead in Syria, and then they kind of stood aside, and it was then envisaged that the Free French would come up and kind of be the ones who actually took over Damascus. But the Free French came up to the front and effectively refused to fight. And that it basically broke down. The British Indian Brigade basically got destroyed in these French tank attacks, and it was left to some Australian forces who actually, in the end, subdued the last defence and sort of took Damascus. And that, there's some quite funny stories about how it all played out, because this was very much not the look that the British or the French were going for, was to have these Australians kind of rushing in and partying in the streets and getting into bar fights and things. And then, this sort of played out over the course of years, as these countries eventually gained independence. But, the British, first of all, they didn't want to be seen to take Damascus, and then they didn't want to be seen to be garrisoning Damascus. So they wanted de Gaulle's force to stay in Damascus, to be seen as being the ones who were sort of occupying it, whereas de Gaulle wanted to get out and continue the fight, as did the Australians. And so everything sort of breaks down into this kind of political back and forth. It definitely had an impact on the fighting. I mean, and probably caused, some unnecessary prolonging of the campaign. It's an interesting war in that respect. In these political considerations almost play a bigger role than the actual fighting forces themselves.
Maitland Wilson, Jumbo does actually hand it over to the Australians. So this does ultimately become an Australian operation, doesn't it? Rather than, when we talk about allies and British, it is actually an Australian operation where the whole of the 7th Division sort of takes part. As you say, there's elements of other Australian units there. Does that change the nature of the operation with the Australians running their own show?
Well, I think I don't know that it made that much practical difference. I mean, Wilson sort of handed over, this handover was sort of in terms of the administration, like he handed over to 1st Australian Corps, which was kind of in charge of the planning and execution of everything. As the campaign wore on, there were multiple shufflings of command, multiple shufflings of arrangements of troops. And so in the end, you had the Australians, they sort of all ended up being concentrated on the coast just south of Beirut. So the entire 7th, the division, they as I said, they started with only 2 brigades, but they sort of by the end had made up that 3rd brigade, and they had a full division of troops on that front. The British had taken over the central sector and the Damascus sector along with those Free French. So, and the fight that happened south of Beirut at a place called the Damour River, that was probably the biggest battle of the campaign. That happened quite late, and that was quite decisive in that once that French stronghold fell, it sort of opened the path to Beirut. And that was a big a big battle. Like, when you think about this war, you think about that it was sort of quaint in that it was kind of a political war and an unnecessary war. But that was a full division, of Australians deployed in a very serious battle. It almost never happened that you'd get a full division fighting, a battle at once. And so, that was definitely serious fighting. And something that the Australians rightly should be proud of.
Yeah, and it's a Roden Cutler wins his VC, his Victoria Cross. Although I didn't make a note of what he won it for. What did he win it for?
It was sort of given not for one specific action, but for sort of a period of a couple of weeks where he was an artillery officer and he sort of found himself in all sorts of interesting situations. He would sort of go forward and get behind the French lines and be trying to speak back to the artillery to direct the fire. His actions sort of played a decisive role in a couple of these battles. And then at Dunmore, he'd gone forward on his own, literally, and he'd captured a bunch of prisoners at gunpoint, and French prisoners, and sent them back to the Australian lines. And then, as he was going forward, he was shot with a machine gun, and he ended up losing his leg. But he was kind of left in a ditch basically for a day or more without anyone being able to get to him. But eventually he was found, and these French prisoners who he'd captured actually helped him pick him up and stretcher him back to safety. And so he's had a prominent career in politics back in Australia. But that was his. He won a Victoria Cross. There was another Victoria Cross awarded to a guy by the name of Jim Gordon, who was fighting in that central sector in the mountains, for single-handedly attacking machine gun posts on his own. So you had these 2 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australian soldiers. So it's a campaign that isn't necessarily. There's mixed feelings. It is sort of not necessarily a sense of shame that we were fighting against the French, but it just seems, in hindsight, so unnecessary. Like, we were on the same side in the First World War, obviously, and then, and these particular armies, they ended up on the same side again later in this war. Like, by 1943, the Vichy, they sort of flip-flopped and ended up eventually back on the side of the Allies. So I think that's the only thing that sort of mars the campaign. Not not for the soldiers in terms of what they had to sacrifice and give up, but it probably never got the recognition that it deserved, because it was potentially a bit of an embarrassment for the British, because they, as we've mentioned, they didn't really expect, I think, to fight. They just expected to walk through and it to be a submission.
Is the campaign still remembered in Australia? I mean, as I say, I wasn't familiar with it at all. It's kind of, there was. I didn't realise.
It's not really at all. I hardly anyone I've ever spoken to, unless you're particularly familiar with Australian World War II history, almost no one's heard of it. For me, I came across it because I was working up in New Guinea as a tour guide. There's along the Kokoda Track, which is this famous battle between the Australians and the Japanese in 1942, and that is very famous in Australia. We've got our well-known military campaigns, probably Gallipoli being the first one, but the Kokoda Track is probably the most celebrated campaign of the Second World War, and Australians.
I remember watching about it. Well, I remember watching it as a kid on that documentary series, The Sullivans.
Really?
I hated The Sullivans, where I used to hang on as a kid, waiting for the Kokoda Trail to come on, because that was a bit I wanted to watch, and then to get back to the Australian soap opera part of it.
Well, it's funny that I think even here, that particular campaign only really started to receive recognition in the last couple of decades. I mean that was not recognised for a long time, and so certainly what happened in Syria is kind of buried. But it's the same troops. So that was the 7th Division. After they came back from the Middle East, they then got sent up to New Guinea. I got the chance to meet some of those veterans and talk to them, and that was kind of how my interest was sparked about this campaign in Syria and Lebanon against the Vichy French. So yes, it's not as if it's something well known in Australia, but lost in the rest of the world. It's pretty much unknown here as well.
I wondered if at the time, that you're looking at your Pathé newsreels, if they more spun other things happening in the Western Desert, which kind of eclipsed it at the time, and that eclipsing of it in the war narrative during the war meant that the news just hasn't carried on being filtered. Those Tobruk and the
yes, exactly. I think
the desert campaign.
I think you're correct, and this was something I tried to find an answer to, which was the campaign actually suppressed? Like, was there an effort by the British or anyone to try and actually not report on the goings on, and that actually possibly was the case in terms of the news that was getting back to the UK, but certainly in the Australian newspapers, I was able to find some of the old ones, and it was reported on quite freely as to what was going on in Syria. And I also found that, once the British journalists realised that this information was getting back to Australia, so, that they weren't necessarily getting, they sort of started kind of tapping into that source of news to report it back to their own papers. But I think you're right that it's not like it's some conspiracy or anything. It's really just that it's a confusing war, and the rats of Tobruk, or these campaigns in the North African desert, are kind of perhaps more romantic and more easy to understand.
Against Rommel.
Yes, exactly. And then obviously in New Guinea, we're sort of literally fighting the Japanese on our own doorstep. So that's kind of imprinted in our consciousness, whereas this sort of gets lost. The other thing is that almost to the day that the campaign in Syria ends, it's the beginning of the war. The Germans invade Russia, so Barbarossa begins, and so I think, and the entire focus of the war shifts. And there's a great quote from one of the Australian journalists who was in Damascus, saying, here I am, what am I doing here? Like, no one is going to care about this now. I got to get, now that war's broken out against Russia, and that sort of turned out to be accurate. And that, within hindsight, is the thing that made it clear that this war was a little bit unnecessary, in that, the Germans obviously had their hands full planning that campaign and weren't really interested in any decisive action in Syria.
Richard, thanks. It is the Levant is a fascinating corner of the war that I wasn't aware of. Thank you for that. Loyal listener, if you would like to know more about the campaign, the book to read is Australia's War with France, the campaign in Syria and Lebanon, 1941. Next time, I'll be discussing the opportunities missed by Eisenhower when he stuck rigidly to his broad front strategy in 1944-45 in Northwest Europe. Don't forget, if you do enjoy the podcast, you can find me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/WW2podcast. That $1 or so each month from those supporters of the show really does help me to put time aside to make the podcast. Finally, this episode of the podcast was supported by History Guild, the Victorian Government and the Victorian Veterans Council. To find out more about this project, visit historyguild.org. Well, that's all for me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.